very black. And in that prayer, he acknowledged and called for the blessings of God on the President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. The reason that was noteworthy is that has been a contested issue among politicians on Capitol Hill for weeks as to whether or not Joe Biden could be described as president-elect. Many had stepped forward and said yes, but many resisted. The acknowledgement by the chaplain caught me by a little surprise this morning, and I came to the floor to hear the Republican leader, Senator McConnell, go through an accounting of the Trump presidency and all of his achievements, and then conclude by acknowledging as well that we have a president-elect in Joe Biden. I believe that that reflected the reality of the November 3rd election and the finality of the Electoral College decisions being made across the nation in so many states. I thank those who have stepped forward to acknowledge the reality of the new president and hope that they will join me in an effort to do our best to make certain that his tenure is a success, not just for him personally and the vice president, but for our nation. We deserve nothing less. It's a long story, these last few weeks since November 3rd and what's happened across America. I don't think anyone could have predicted that we would see the divisive reaction that we have seen. Nor could anyone have predicted what happened yesterday. Some states had to take extraordinary measures to protect Electoral College electors. What used to be a routine, somewhat tedious and boring mission resulted in the closing of legislative buildings in Michigan to the public and, according to press reports, credible threats of violence. In Arizona, electors met in an undisclosed location to safely cast their votes. These measures followed a last-ditch effort by 17 Republican attorneys general and more than half of the House Republican caucus joining in a lawsuit and accompanying amicus brief before the Supreme Court, which incredibly argued that the court should nullify the votes of more than 20 million Americans. These ludicrous arguments couldn't hide the true justification for joining this effort to undermine our democracy. The people who were protesting simply don't like the results of the 2020 election, and they don't want to turn their backs on President Trump. The conservative-leaning Supreme Court summarily dismissed this effort outright, rejecting the lawsuit in an order on Friday evening, wasting no time in doing it. Despite repeated and forceful judicial rejections of their baseless allegations of fraud and attempts to nullify the votes of Americans, only 27 congressional Republicans would publicly acknowledge the obvious president-elect of the United States, Joe Biden, as of last week. Now that the Electoral College has spoken, more congressional Republicans are finally stepping up. But the fact that it took 6 weeks for my colleagues to recognize reality and stop undermining our democratic process is sad and disappointing. When we were sworn in as members of Congress, we took a simple oath: support, defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Foreign and domestic. It's not an oath to one person nor one president. It's not conditional if one receives enough angry phone calls. It's not dependent on whether the responsibilities are difficult. And it's certainly not optional if one has to face a more challenging electorate. And yet, with the exception of only a few in this Senate chamber, the silence in upholding this oath in the face of President Trump's blatant attempts to undermine our democracy has been overwhelming. Just compare it to the courage shown by state and local election officials across the United States, including many Republicans who always hastened to add that they had voted for President Trump, They were disappointed in the election of Joe Biden, but the election in their state, by their measure, was honest and fair. They don't enjoy the perks and protections we have here in Congress, but they stepped up and spoke up, and I respect them for it. Proud Americans of both parties under personal threat for their integrity in defending an American election that the President of the United States once overturned. Senator Murphy, the junior senator from Connecticut, came to the floor on Friday and spoke eloquently about this threat to American democracy that has been playing out in plain sight. The blatant and shameful attempt to use the power of the presidency to overturn a free and fair election, an election which is the foundation of our democracy. Senator Murphy reminded us about the fragility of our democracy and how it should never, ever be taken for granted. And he warned about collaborating in silence as these efforts are made to destroy it. How democracies die. The poignant remarks and the outrageous actions of recent weeks reminded me of a dinner I hosted with the authors of a powerful book, How Democracies Die. The authors, Stephen Levitsky, Daniel Ziblatt, detail examples in which democracies are weakened, collapse, and even are destroyed. I recommend it as urgent reading to my colleagues in the Senate at this moment in our history. They highlighted the critical role of established political leaders in standing up or failing to stand up in key moments when events or persons threaten their democracies. Venezuela in the early 1990s, a key establishment party leader opportunistically sided with Hugo Chavez after a coup attempt, devastatingly giving Chavez critical legitimacy he then used to gain power and bring this country to its current state of decline. I believe we have such a moment here that demands leaders of both parties to carry out their oaths of office and defend our treasured democracy. Quite simply, silence is unacceptable. I'm glad for what Senator McConnell said this morning on the floor of the Senate. Perhaps Chaplain Black inspired him and will inspire others to step up and speak the truth. Madam President, on a separate issue, I've given a big part of my life to this institution, the Senate, and I respect what we have been able to do on many occasions. Through honest give and take and compromise, we have been able to bring legislation to this floor, to debate it, to consider amendments, to pass the legislation, and ultimately not only make a law, but change the lives of Americans. We were at that moment where we need it again. And 10 of us, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, as well as House members, decided 3 weeks ago that enough was enough. We needed to show some leadership and try to work out a compromise between us for another COVID relief package. You see, it's been 9 months since we passed what was known as the CARES Act on the floor of the Senate, 96-0. Overwhelmingly unanimous, bipartisan decision to spend about $3 trillion, not only to fight the pandemic, but to restore our economy. Thank goodness we did. It really gave us an opportunity to do something for America when it desperately needed it. We thought that the threat of the pandemic would soon ebb away, but it did not. It wasn't gone in 6 months. It isn't gone today. In fact, in some places in America, it's worse now than ever. My state of Illinois, despite the heroic efforts of my governor and many others, is suffering with infections, hospitalizations, and sadly, many, many, too many deaths. That is the reality of where we are today. And so this group of 10, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, have been meeting for 3 weeks, even on Thanksgiving Day, when we did a Zoom call, had some conversation about a phase of this that might be important for us to consider. I tell you that because we did produce a work product, and one that I think is worthy of consideration immediately on the floor of the Senate. It was an effort to reach a spending target of $908 billion to provide immediate assistance across the board in the United States, to extend unemployment benefits where they are desperately needed, to give help to businesses, some $300 billion in new lending authority, to provide additional funds for SNAP, the food stamp program, which many desperate families turn to feed their children, help to our farmers, help to the renters who are facing eviction under their leases if we did nothing, help to hospitals and nursing homes and clinics. We all know they're on the front line of this battle. Money for testing of those who suspect that they are infected with COVID-19, and more resources for the logistics of vaccinations. The CDFI program is an effort to extend lending authority, particularly in desperate communities that are battling both poverty as well as this pandemic. $5 billion for mental health, and we certainly know we need it. The psychological pressure that America is facing is obvious in so many ways. Education, over $80 billion in education. $10 billion in child care. We can't overlook the fact that many can't return to work because there's no child care that they trust with their kids. Help as well for expanding broadband. As our kids have to turn to remote learning in many places in America, broadband has to become a fact of life across this nation. $45 billion in the whole transportation system network that's been devastated by this economic downturn. $10 billion to our Postal Service. They're working harder than ever, and we want to make sure the men and women of the Postal Service who do such a remarkable job know that we have their back. Extensions of spending authority for the CARES Act are just a few of the things that we considered over the 3-week period. We came up with a bill that spends $748 billion. There were 2 items that were not included in the base consensus bill because we couldn't reach a consensus on them. State and local government assistance, I support completely. I know my cities, my counties, and what my state has gone through. They need help. We couldn't agree on including that in the package at this moment. I hope that changes even today. And finally, the issue of liability and immunity from liability. This has been one that's been raised by Senator McConnell for months. He's basically said that nothing is moving until he gets a provision, which I find objectionable, originally offered by Senator Cornyn. And here's what it comes down to. Should people be able to go to court if they believe that they have been harmed or members of their family have died as a result of the wrongdoing of people during this COVID-19 pandemic? Some argue that businesses should not have that possibility hanging over their head, and that's what Senator Cornyn used as a basis for his provisions that make it almost impossible for anyone to recover for any losses during COVID-19. Others believe that we need to show an even-handed approach to this on both sides. If we are going to be fair to businesses who are legitimately in good faith trying to protect their employees and customers, we should also leave the possibility open that those who are responsible for their actions need to be held accountable in court. I think that is a simple and basic provision, that there be equity on both sides, not just for plaintiffs, but also for defendants. We tried mightily during the last several weeks, and I want to salute my colleagues that engaged directly in that effort, Angus King of Maine and Tim Kaine of Virginia, Chris Coons of Delaware, Dick Blumenthal of Connecticut, Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire. We offered a variety of options which we thought were reasonable and served the purpose of justice, but we couldn't reach an agreement. The others on the Democratic side who were part of this overall effort deserve mention in the record. I don't want to miss anyone, but I want to include certainly Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Mark Warner of the state of Virginia, and Jean Shaheen of New Hampshire. For all of them, I thank them for bringing forth this measure, and now It's going to be in the hands of the leadership. I hope that we can call it this week. We should not go home without it. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Democratic leader.
Thank you, Madam President. Now, as the Republican leader rightly acknowledged a few moments ago, Joe Biden will be the next president of the